Our next session focuses on standardization as an interoperability enabler and critical element to capability development. Standardization of equipment, doctrine, tactics, terminology, processes, and procedures are critical to ensure the United States and its allies and partners are able to cooperate in multinational force operations. The panel is comprised of Mr. Robert Trabucchi, head of NATO Standardization Office Policy Section. Mr. Trabucchi has over 11 years experience with headquarters NATO and many years as an Army officer and strategist working multinational and civil military cooperation efforts. Next will be Commander Nicholas Marianos, the NATO Standardization Management Group Education Panel Chairman and Standardization Manager at the Hellenic National Defense General Staff Defense Planning Directorate. And third will be Mr. Eric Fleming, who works for OUSD A&S International Cooperation Office. His portfolio includes the NATO Committee for Standardization and the Logistics Committee. Additionally, he's a board member for the NATO Support and Procurement Organization. Please welcome Mr. Trabucchi, Commander Marianos, and Mr. Fleming to this forum to present standardization in support of interoperability with allies.
Can I do an audio check to see if you can hear me?
We can hear you.
Excellent. Okay. So then I'll start with good day, everyone. I'm going to cover these two topics today, first interoperability and then standardization, with a focus on the differences that we see at the multinational level or the alliance level with the national level. And I'll try in each of these areas to answer the why and the what question, and only get into the details of how by talking about the principles level, approach the topic in that way, not getting into procedures and processes, because you know standardization as well as I do. Then I would just want to highlight my three key messages right up front in those areas, and that's that these differences manifest in the what, in the why, and the how. In the what, I liken multinational standardization to the New York City public school system that I grew up in. We move at the pace of the slowest student. We try to keep that student moving as quickly as possible through various forms of encouragement, but it nevertheless has certain requirements at the multinational level that do slow it down compared to most or many of the nations. In the why.
This, Michael, sorry to interject here. Just wanted to let you know, I think we're seeing your notes in next slide screen. So if you may want to switch to your display screen if you're using multiple monitors.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. Let me try to move to that. I'm a little show taskbar.
Display settings.
I believe you
display settings. Thanks. You guys are going to walk me through this.
There you go.
Does that work?
Yes. Perfect.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I was afraid you were interrupting me because of bad audio or internet connection. This is a much better reason to be interrupted. Thanks for that help.
Yep, we hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. All right. And if I do drop out, as my audio has here, it normally comes back in less than 5 seconds. So I ask you all to just bear with me. Thanks. So in the why area, the key difference is the purpose of interoperability. And this is really a strategic concern for the alliance. Coherence is essential to the alliance because fundamentally we are many and many different nations who must act as one. So interoperability is really at the core of our being, and people refer to standardization sometimes as the DNA of the alliance for that reason. And in the how, certainly there are many similarities in the processes, but that need for consensus and the way that the alliance understands consensus as a complete absence of objection is different than you'll find in many SDOs, even at that multinational level. So those are my key messages in those 3 question areas regarding the differences between. Dive into this, just one word about where I come from. The NATO Standardization Office, one might compare it very broadly to the Defense Standardization Program Office. Our role within the alliance is to administer and coordinate standardization activities across a broad range of stakeholders and to be the publishing agent for the standards. We support nations' development of standards and their approval of standards and their agreement to them, and we promote nations' implementation of standards, just to give you sort of where your briefer is coming from on this. So I'll move to my next slide. So I'll start with interoperability and the why of interoperability. The example on the left was perhaps the most complex multinational structure that NATO had in the Cold War. If we think of that commander who had multinational forces directly reporting to him in the Cold War, then if we think of that person as a multinational integrator, then the multinational integrator was a 4-star general, normally. Again, this example on the slide is the most extreme version, with a multinational staff to rely upon, and who had 30 years of career experience under his belt, probably experience fighting in World War II itself. But today, our multinational integrator, she's a major or a captain. He has perhaps no staff whatsoever and has only about 5 to 10 years of military experience. So that is shown by the example on the right hand of the slide, which is taken directly from a very high readiness joint task force within NATO in about the year 2017, 2018. And from that level of multinational integration, you can see that the value of interoperability has increased a great deal, and it has gone into new areas at these new tactical levels that I was just describing as a key takeaway for the change. Let me talk now on the next slide about another dimension of change in the requirements for interoperability. Since the Cold War, the way we have built multinational teams has changed as well. Even through the missions in S4 in Bosnia, K4 in Kosovo, ISAF in Afghanistan, our multinational teams were built in a way that is shown on the left-hand side of this slide. Relatively static, slow, sure, and relatively single service. In a collective defense scenario that we are focused on increasingly since 2014 in NATO, they are now to be put together in conditions that are dynamic, perhaps frantically rushed, uncertain, and beyond joint, all domain, to include cyber, space, and so on. So this puts a premium on interoperability. To have a force that works more like Legos than Lincoln Logs, a force that works more like Minecraft than Space Invaders, gives our commanders the flexibility of fit. When we have forces that do not fit with any of our other forces, we create additional friction and problems for our commanders and our leaders, also at the political level. So these changes, this interoperability, is a war winner for alliances and for coalitions, because coalitions can't just be willing, they have to be capable, they have to fit together. So with that understanding of the why, today of interoperability, I move to unpack a little bit the what of interoperability. This is NATO's definition of interoperability since about 2009. You'll note that we do not aim for sameness. We aim more purposefully. We keep a low bar. The KISS principle, which I described previously as the New York City public school system, is in full operation here. And that's a difference that I think you can see from the briefings that we've seen earlier in the conference today, where qualities other than interoperability are quite important to national standardization in the United States. Whereas we in NATO are focused on this interoperability and a certain degree of efficiency. We're focused at objectives, and perhaps presciently back in 2009, they included that we should be looking already at the tactical and operational levels. So that's our definition and some of the key elements of it. Now, how do we pursue interoperability in the alliance? These are the 5 recognized tools for interoperability, and you'll see that standards, of course, are there and shown at the bottom for sort of a foundation. In fact, the 2 tools shown at the bottom are a little focused on our procedures, what we call operational standards, our tactics, our doctrine, a little bit more focused there. Whereas at the top of the list, those tools are focused a little bit more on material, systems, and platforms. And in between is the missing link. We have more lessons lost than we have lessons learned in many national systems. This was something I think I already faced as a US Army officer, but indeed much more challenging at the alliance level because we have to encourage nations to, in a sense, air their dirty laundry in order to bring lessons forward and share them across the alliance. But our observation is that if one nation is struggling with a certain area, then many nations are probably struggling with it. So we try to bring these tools together to make them more effective, because part of our observations are that they depend on each other for effectiveness. Even as a young Army officer, I was taught that any exercise, any training consists of a task, the conditions, and the standards by which we measure what we must achieve with that task. So we can see that standards were essential to the other tools here. And to show how those are integrated, we talk about loops. For example, 2 different loops can be shown with this simple slide that connect interoperability tools. The first might be standards being brought into exercises so that those exercises produce lessons that tell us how to improve those standards. A second way to interpret this slide and apply this loop here is standards brought into the units, which are then brought into evaluations, will produce lessons that help us to improve the units and their use of standards. But each of these, as you can see, require several or multiple of the tools that were seen on the previous slide. And so this is a concept, these loops, that we have been integrating into NATO policies beyond standardization, NATO policies beyond interoperability, the education, training, exercises, and evaluations policy, for example, or into the directives signed by SACEUR or by the Strategic Allied Commander for Transformation. So now that I have described that sort of what, how, and why of interoperability, you have already the context and the purpose of standardization. In fact, the why of standardization, to serve, as I said previously, interoperability. In NATO, interoperability is nearly the whole purpose. Efficiency is important in as part of interoperability, but also in the development of capabilities. And here, Commander Mirionis, your next briefer, will get into the details of what is a revolution in how we approach standardization and by integrating it into the Alliance's flagship process enterprise-wide for developing capabilities and harmonizing the capability development of the 30 allies. These capabilities, this capability development is a bridge here in the purpose of standardization to those other programs in NATO. The Alliance's permanent challenge of the budgets and the capacities for capability development of 30 very diverse allies brings another important difference between national level standardization and alliance level standardization. Efficiency and cost effectiveness are important to ensure that we keep the group together, as described in my allegory of the the New York City public school system. So this is a manifestation of that difference, is this focus on efficiency and cost effectiveness that's central to our ability to keep all of the allies together, in that they all contribute forces that are interoperable but are also affordable for each of them. And so that move towards capability development, the integration into it, is one of two revolutions. The second revolution I'd like to describe in recent NATO initiatives and standardization is shown here, or highlighted here, within this definition that is the what of NATO standardization. We have increased greatly our focus over the last few years in NATO standardization on the implementation or the use of standards by the allies. It was an area relatively untouched until allied heads of state and government agreed to something called the Defense Investment Pledge in 2014. This is where the famous 2% of GDP is found. That's the agreement that brought us that. That same short paragraph of agreement that starts with 2% of GDP ends with the implementation of agreed NATO standards, whereby at the very top political levels, all of the allies agreed that they would implement those standards which they individually ratified for their own country. And so since then, to make a reality of this, NATO standardization community developed an implementation action plan in 2016, and that has been enacted across committees that many of you will be familiar with. Many of you represent the United States in these different committees or their subgroups: the Committee for Standardization, the Military Committee, the Conference of National Armaments Directors, and increasingly the C3 Board. That 2016 action plan also led to the development of a standards-related document to assist the custodians of NATO standards to write better implementation guidance for their standards in the standardization agreements that cover their standards. So now we have advice to custodians to give nations clearer expectations. We have programs for monitoring the use or the implementation of NATO standards, and we have staffs providing recommendations for remedial action where implementation needs improvement. And today we are in the standardization community elaborating and revising that plan based on the lessons we've identified over the past few years. Now I come to the how of standardization, and I promised that I would not get into details beyond the principles, so I'll simply explain a little bit these 7 principles that are found in NATO's standardization policy. For the overarching and systemic approach, we move from a beginning of requirements through solutions to the assessment of standards. And it's important that we have this systemic approach with each of these phases because allies want to make decisions and control the process at each step of the way. And that has been updated recently in the procedures for the production and maintenance of NATO standards. We call it Allied Administrative Publication 3 in its recent edition of 2018. That edition also highlighted a balance in the second principle of timeliness, which addresses this alliance level challenge, perhaps a difference from the national level, where that strict consensus principle can sometimes slow us down. So we introduced immediately the principle that we have to move at the speed of relevance. Third, implementation and a commitment to it, which I have already discussed at some length. And again, you will hear more about one of the mechanisms by which we evaluate this in the next presentation. So I move on then to transparency. This is important for the consensus principle to come to agreement among the allies. They have to all be included, but it also extends beyond that and is represented in the cooperation between NATO and the European Union, or the involvement of non-allies, partner nations, which can extend from, just to pick a few recent examples, Colombia to Singapore, and ensures a broader use of NATO standards and broader interoperability. Further civil standards, you've already had a couple of presentations today about how this helps to speed processes, even more so perhaps at the alliance level, because many nations are involved in those standards developing organizations, and if they have already come to agreement, it eases our consensus process. Finally, the last two, consistency and coherence, are important because of NATO's committee structure, and I listed just a few of those that are active in standardization here. Recently, the NATO Standardization Office gave additional duties to many of its officers as standardization advisors to help those committees and their subgroups move their standards along more effectively, in a more timely fashion. And the NATO Standardization Office has provided updates to those committees on the health of their standards portfolio and the use of standards in their area. Finally, terminology, of course, is the foundation. Language is essential to our interoperability, our ability to understand each other. If I tell one of my British officers that I left the keys to the vehicle in my boot, I mean, he should go look in my shoes and pull the keys out of where I hid them. But he will tell me I was a fool for putting the keys in the boot because that's the trunk of the car and now we can't drive anywhere. So there's a real fundamental ability even within language, a fundamental importance even within one language of making sure we get our terms straight. And recently, NATO developed a database to move the famous Allied Administrative Publication 6, our dictionary of terms and definitions, into the 21st century through a database. So that's just touching on examples of each of these 7 principles, hopefully without getting into too much detail. Hopefully I have characterized the multinational level of interoperability and standardization and brought across these differences in the what, the why, and the how of keeping the allies together and keeping things simple for them so that they stay together. That concludes my briefing. Thank you very much.